for the sake of the recording. It's going to be Issi Rosen-Zvi talking about the missing links, cities as regulators of global value chains, and we'll have Pankhuri Agarwal as a discussant. Thank you both again for agreeing to be our final speakers, as commonly said, last but not least. So thank you very much, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ila. Thank you, Guy. There's a story about, I don't know if it's true, about Levi Eshkol, the former Prime Minister of Israel, that when he stood up to speak at party conventions, he would say, before I begin, I want to say a few words. So before I begin, I want to say a few words. Like Roy, I'm a newcomer to the GVC world, and it's not my natural playground. And I bring an outsider's perspective to the table with all its advantages, but mostly its disadvantages. So when Hila asked me to switch places with Catherine and Jen, I was initially, of course, bummed. It's Friday afternoon. It's the very last session of the workshop. You are all very exhausted. But in retrospect, it turns out to be a great decision. After these 3 days, during which I've learned a great deal, especially after reading May's excellent article on global company towns. And I'm glad that May showed up because she probably has a lot to contribute to my paper. So after reading her article and some more, my paper seems to me rather Western-centric, naive, detached from reality, and overly optimistic, in other words, silly. So, and I think what led me astray was the celebratory tone of all the GVCs of the world, all this international business literature that Roy described so nicely yesterday in his wonderful essay, and all this focus on upgrading. So the supply chain cities that may described not in this paper, but in the paper that I read on global company towns, are celebrated in Jeremy's article, just like comparing Mexico and China in terms of their ability to upgrade and how beautiful they did it with this supply chain cities, which only later I read that are pretty horrible. I do still believe that the paper offers a theoretical contribution to the literature on GVCs by introducing another perspective. Also, I think, that I did not see this perspective in the literature before, even if it's not as significant as I initially thought, because it brings together 3 strands of literature: global value chains, global cities and network and international networks, and local government law that are not often considered in relation to one another. And hopefully in the next draft, I will revise first of all, in the next draft, I'll revise the paper and it will sound less celebratory to kind of better align with the current realities. And this is another apology to Pankhuri for submitting a very incomplete paper. Most of the important content is not there yet. And I think, lucky for me, because now I have a lot to think about and add to, as I'll say in a minute, to the political side of it. So I'm very much looking forward to your comments, and don't have mercy on me. Just be brutal. It's for you, Pankhuri, and for the others as well, because I deserve it. And now I begin. So let me.
2 minutes left. Yeah.
I'll do it really quickly. Do you see this?
Yes, we do.
Look how nice it is. This is Gamma, which I took from Hila. I saw Hila presented a very nice presentation, powerful presentation. I said to myself, how come? And then it was written, made with Gamma. So I looked up Gamma and look what it does. Anyway, okay. So as I said, what my paper is trying to do is to explore the potential that cities have as regulators of global value chains by challenging the traditional perspective that limits subnational entities that consider subnational entities and completely ill-adapt to the reality of global value chains by examining both the economic, the political, and the legal capacities of cities. And here I add this cautionary note that it might seem kind of detached from reality, but I think, again, there is something to it. I'll jump over the question of the complexity of GVCs. You all know that. And when you explore the current regulators of GVCs, what you see that all of them are lacking. So you have states that has no incentive a lot of time and no jurisdiction, international entities which are too weak, private actors that are ineffective and mostly voluntary. So the result is that regulators face limitation both in legal authority and incentives, economic, etc., that lead to a race to the bottom in standards, board environmental, labor, and human rights. And what I want to bring to the table is an attempt to think about cities as regulators. And I think the reason, the conventional wisdom is that cities cannot do that is that they are seen as even less effective than states, right? So the states cannot be relied upon to act as regulators due to global competition for mobile capital, etc. It's clearly that subdivisions of the state are ill-suited for the task. Now, I think that if you wed the GVC literature with the global cities literature, what you see that this view is misguided because it fails to grasp the role of cities in the global economy, and a deeper understanding of cities in the international marketplace could lead us that contrary to the prevailing orthodoxy, the concentration of economic activities in certain cities and regions grant them greater capacities to redistribute wealth and protect the human and labor rights than standard models suggest, even if the nation state in which they are located has less capacity and less incentive. So there are three prongs to the argument. The first prong is the economic one. When I say that global firms has to concentrate on, or has to, even though we think that in information era, there is no need for a space, okay? Territoriality is not important anymore. The global city literature show that this is completely incorrect. And actually, global firms that have faced a lot of challenges, incomplete knowledge, need to access to skilled labor, efficient transportation, and producer services like lawyers, accountants, advertising, etc., they actually need to concentrate in specific places. And so when we look about specific cities, a specific kind of cities, like global cities, like port cities that are major transportation hubs, and like production hubs where the production takes place, what can be called supply chain cities, the argument that cities, that corporations and capital are fully mobile is not true. Is shown as incorrect. Here is the weakest link of the paper right now. And the argument in the paper right now, there is no argument in the paper because this part is not written yet. But what I thought I'm going to write here is about the fact that cities also have different incentives than their states in terms of catering to different constituencies. So if the country as a whole, the state as a whole, have to think about economic development in the entire state, and the constituency is the entire population, so sacrificing a certain city is not a big deal. For city leaders, okay, this is not true. They care about the environment, they cared about the labor standards, etc., because they are measured differently than the state leaders. Okay, now fundamentally, the structure of government must be democratic in order for that to work. In authoritarian regime where residents cannot vote or otherwise lack political power, the issue shifts to what the government seeks to achieve. So if the government prioritizes economic development, I'm talking of either the local authorities as well, over labor rights, human rights, environmental sustainability, cities will be not only ineffective but actually complicit in the in infringement of this right. As again, I read in May's article about the strike in Donggun, something like that, China, that local authorities were very effective in violently intervening and stopping the strike. So here it should be, I should advance with cautious thinking about which cities I'm talking about, which countries, etc. And the part that most that I think my contribution can be most of the contribution will be there. It's the legal conditions for local governments of GVCs to work. Okay, so the fact that they can be effective both economically and politically does not say that they would be. It depends on actually the legal power, the autonomy from central government, etc. And here, what I will try to do is think about which powers of the city can actually bring to bear on GVCs and on multinational corporations located within the city jurisdiction. And here I'm thinking about both direct powers like living wage, with also the literature and local governments said that this is impossible, that no city would actually have living wage ordinance because they're competing for labor and etc. in the state market. And this proved incorrect as well. We could think about environmental regulation, but, and this I took from a wonderful article by Ben Sachs about preemption, and he shows in this article, which I'm sure most of you that work in the labor area know, what he shows that the cities, that local governments, even if they are not able to enact any legislation and ordinances that apply to labor directly, they can do a lot of things that affect labor, like zoning, like business licensing, like public procurement, etc. And so I will try to map all these legal powers that could affect positively the regulation of GVCs by local governments. And the last thing is looking for examples. And this is a challenging issue. I read a lot of literature on that. I read some literature about, so China is interesting. I don't want to say, but I want to stop here, but China is interesting because despite the total dependence of local governments in China on the central government, it actually, because the central government had sometime an interest in regulating the environment, they actually authorize local governments to do that, and then they put in motion a process in which actually local governments are effective regulators of the environment, but not because they're autonomous, but because they are not autonomous. India is interesting, and maybe Pankhuri can shed light on this. I read a lot about the amendment of the Constitution that grants local authorities autonomy, but that it's so far it has both because of the Supreme Court and the political reality, it has failed. So local governments are rather weak, which would, hinder their ability to serve. Of course, United States and Europe are different, and I'll stop here. Pankhuri, slaughter me.
I'm just going to start my stopwatch so I don't. Yeah. Thank you, Issi, for your paper, and Guy and Hila for the opportunity to respond to this paper. I also very much enjoyed reading whatever papers I could for the conference, so taking back so many ideas from this. Issi, I really enjoyed reading your paper, and I should probably say a bit about my own context as to where I'm coming from, so that you get an idea of where my comments are coming from as well. I'm a sociologist currently based in a management school. So while reading your paper, I was able to look at the top-down factors about regulation from lead firms, etc., but also the bottom-up factors in terms, and then see how cities as regulators actually sort of are sandwiched in between the context I have studied so far, which are India and UK's garment industry, software industry, and construction industry. So that is where I'm coming from. In terms of your paper specifically, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with a brief explanation of what I understood the paper is about, because it is a conceptual paper. And then I'm going to give my comments for conceptual clarity and theoretical clarity separately. And these comments are less comments, but more like questions to hopefully help you focus the paper more. So while reading the paper, its significance clearly stood out to me, the potential of the paper in terms of an inward lens to argue that regulation must be examined at the local and intra-organizational levels. And as you clearly mentioned in the paper, but also in your presentation, that the dominant narrative in GVC regulation has so far focused on transnational governance, supply chain monitoring, corporate social responsibility. So most of these regulation comes from how firms and institutions respond to external pressures. But clearly, like you argue in your paper as well, this external sort of perspective often overlooks how regulatory mechanisms operate within urban economies and at the local level. So in this sense, your paper takes an important direction in terms of arguing that cities can become critical sites for understanding GVC regulation, not just as nodes in global networks of supply chains, but as spaces where labor regimes, informal economies, and regulatory interventions can converge. So that is something that I took away from the paper in terms of its novelty. As how cities become these critical sites. And in your paper also, I could see that there has been some effort to argue that urban economies mediate the implementation of labor standards, shape how workers navigate regulatory constraints and opportunities, and probably there is scope in the paper to also reveal the tensions between this sort of compliance to regulation, the resistance at the local level, and everyday labor practices as well. So as you define your central aim in the paper as well, it's to explore the legal conditions under which cities can, and in some ways already do, function as effective regulators of global value chains. So this is what I could understand while reading your paper in terms of situating cities as regulators, and where external pressures and sort of local bottom-up pressures can converge and provide interesting insights for regulation in GVCs. I have two very broad comments. So one is on the conceptual positioning of the paper itself. So I'll start with that. So one question that came to my mind early on is the distinction between local government and cities. So why use one term over the other? Are you primarily looking at the regulatory power of local governments, or are you making a broader case about cities as economic and political actors? Or does your argument rest on cities' unique political and economic leverage, or on the formal powers of municipal governance? I think at the outset of a paper like this, it would help to clarify the difference between cities as equalizers in GVCs and local governments as regulators. Because like when you, in your presentation, during the end of your presentation, you mentioned about the Indian constitution, the amendments, and how the powers are distributed between the local government and the national government. And indeed, I would like to encourage you to explore that local governments in that context are actually not weak as regulators. They hold substantial powers. And I will explain that through some illustrations in my comments as well. So conceptually, these are the questions that I thought would help to clarify the distinction between local government and cities. And I feel that distinction is very, very important when you're talking about regulation in GVCs across contexts, because you're also saying that you will be bringing empirical context from US, Europe to countries like China and India, where the division of state powers in regulation between local governments and central government is very different across countries. So I think the distinction between local governments and cities at the outset is important. I liked that you mentioned Saskia Sassen's work on urban knowledge capital, and that's a great reference. And you rightly note in the paper that this is deeply tied to legal and state power. Here, I thought that perhaps the argument could be strengthened by differentiating between, and these are just ideas about conceptually positioning and strengthening your paper. When you're evoking urban knowledge capital as a tool to argue that this urban knowledge capital is tied to legal and state power, perhaps the argument could be strengthened by differentiating between urban space as a site of knowledge transfer and then provincial regulation as a function of sort of state decentralization, in terms of how states decentralize their power for regulation vis-a-vis the external pressures of lead firms, trade agreements, etc. So again, my point here is to encourage you to think about this distinction between the powers that provincial governments hold vis-a-vis how urban knowledge capital is understood in the literature on cities as sites of political economic struggles. And to illustrate, so far my comments have the intention was to encourage you to think more about the distinction between states and provincial government. And I'll give you an example why I'm stressing on this. So I'll give a very brief, sorry, I'm just checking the time. Yeah, so I'll give a very brief example from my research in India and Leicester's garment industry. So for example, Leicester's history as a garment hub is shaped not just by legal regulations, but also by informal and community-based governance. So kinship ties, religious networks, ethnic loyalty, all play roles in shaping decent work regulation within Leicester's garment hub in the UK. Here, then city space becomes material and regulatory power emerges through a mix of legal, private, and quasi-legal mechanisms. So here, like through this example, you can see how city space becomes material, but then regulatory power itself is a mixture of legal, private, and quasi-legal mechanisms. And that's why my point about the distinction between city as a material space vis-a-vis the provincial government from which regulation is being enacted in this material space of the city itself. However, if you look at the Indian case, the GVC clusters, the garment clusters, in the Indian context, regulation is deeply embedded in industrialization patterns, migration flows, and cultural divisions. So unlike Leicester, where community ties play a major role in regulation of not just the city space, but also how the local council interacts with global and national laws in GVCs, Indian factory spaces are shaped by linguistic and regional politics, which are not formally regulated by state or MNCs, but instead are controlled by local real estate interests. And this is where the regulatory power of the provincial governments comes into force. And that's why I earlier mentioned why provincial government in the Indian case can be much, much stronger than and have more power than national government, because here the politics between regional and state governments, the history of where special economic zones have been there to provide more power to neoliberal interests, but also more importantly how this interplay of power between provincial and national governments is divided in the constitution. So for example, certain subjects like civil law and labor law, there are certain sub-subjects within that which are under the authority of provincial governments, but then the larger subjects like criminal law and others are within the jurisdiction of the national government. And this distinction then becomes more important in areas like garment clusters in India, which have a history of special economic zones, and where these powers have been curtailed to let GVCs come in and increase trade, blah, 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 in influencing the local regional politics. But all of this is happening in the background of the larger linguistic and regional politics of the region. So my intention to bring this comparison between Leicester and India's GVC, garment GVC, was to suggest how the spatial organization of GVCs in the cities of Leicester and in India, for example, Tirupur, vis-a-vis the provincial government's power to regulate these, is also determined not just by legal or formal governance, but also by quasi-legal governance mechanism. And that's where I think that making a distinction between cities and local government is very important for a conceptual paper like this, so that at the outset, your question about are you talking about regulatory power of local governments, or a broader case about cities and economic and political actors, that needs to be clearly laid out. And for me as a sociologist, I can see there are two papers here. One to just look at the regulatory power of local governments vis-a-vis the external governance from lead firms and the national and local sort of governance, and then also looking at cities as material spaces vis-a-vis the economic and political tensions. But I will leave that sort of decision to you, and I'm sure the lawyers in the room will have more insights on if this paper is for a law journal, because that's not where my expertise lies. My final broad comment is about the theoretical framing of the paper. So I felt that you were underselling the theoretical case for studying cities in GVCs. There is strong literature supporting cities as regulators, not per se explicitly, but if you look at research on migrants in GVCs, where there is literature in economic geography and sociology journals around local politics, cultural clashes, and how social dynamics shape working conditions in factories vis-a-vis national labor laws. So bringing in more of this literature can actually help you highlight the theoretical novelty of the paper in terms of how why cities should be seen as regulators. And again, I would stress here for this, if you decide that this is your theoretical framing, that is to position cities as central to understanding regulation and GVCs, then it would again help to clarify if you're arguing that cities regulate in ways that the state does not, or that they step in where state and private regulation fail, or is it both? So I think for a conceptual paper like this sort of, sorry, I'm over time, just one more minute. So I think for a conceptual paper like this sort of mapping or a typology would really help as well. And I was just thinking about other sort of ways in which your theoretical positioning could be strengthened, because I really felt you were underselling it in the introduction, and there is novelty there. And you could think of, again, I would stress the distinction between cities and provincial governments would then feed into decisions about theoretical framing of cities as independent regulators, cities operating in relation to private regulation of MNCs or national governments. So I think all of those questions are something that will follow once you decide the conceptual focus of the paper itself. Yeah, but I really, really enjoyed reading your paper, and I really felt that there is novelty in terms of a more explicit conceptual lens in GVC literature broadly that accounts for the interplay between municipal, provincial, and national legal frameworks. And there is really, really a lot of scope to do here. But as I said, conceptually and theoretically, I think it needs focus. Maybe it is 2 papers, but I think those sort of micro politics, micro tensions, and the division of provincial and national governments constitutionally in countries like India or in China, where urban and rural centers are very clearly demarcated by different laws, vis-a-vis how it is done in countries like Europe and US, would both complicate the analysis for your paper, but I think that is something that could also help you clarify the conceptual focus. So I'll stop here. Sorry for going a few minutes over time.
No, it was wonderful. I didn't want to stop you.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Thank you so much. Issi, do you want to start by responding briefly and then we'll take some more comments, or?
Actually, there are only 6 minutes, so I want to hear what other people
We have
have
a little
to
bit
say.
more because we really don't have comments in the end to say.
No.
So we can steal 5 minutes from the summary.
The comments are great. Distinction between city and local governments is really important. I mushed it, in this paper, but definitely I have to do a lot of work, and it's very important. And so thank you. It's really very good. And thank you for the good words also.
So let's take some questions. Roy, and then Meital.
So one of the things that we're constantly thinking about in these days, but also generally my impression from the GVC literature is that you have this structure where there's a strong player at the top who wants to do all sorts of things, but not take credit or blame for them. And that's what outsourcing is about, in a way. And it seems like what you're playing with, in a way, could also be an outsourcing story of the state, right? So sometimes we have, states don't want to do things or feel like they can't because they're subject to certain pressures. Maybe sometimes one of the dynamics that could be at work here is the kind of dynamic that we see in the market, but this time for the other actors. And it's not at all clear that is ever something that can work, but the possible parallel strikes me as an interesting one. And one other thing is that when you say that some cities will be able to, or localities will be able to exploit the stickiness, right? That capital isn't totally freely mobile. It seems like right away there's a huge distributive question there about which ones will be able to, and you don't say much about your thoughts about that, although I know that you have thoughts about that. So those are the points. Thanks.
Thank you, Roy. Meital.
Yes. So I really like the idea of trying to find a way to strengthen global value chain through local authorities. But my comment, and it's not really a comment, it's more of a suggestion. Suggestion is to refer to the trend in which local authorities are becoming stronger and stronger as the centralized authority or government is becoming weaker, especially in the context of democracies. As they're becoming weaker, the local authorities are becoming more important, stronger, and more meaningful in citizens' life. And you sort of touch upon it in your presentation, but throughout the paper, it's there in the end, but it's almost not there at all. So I think it's a great point, and it's worth mentioning that way earlier in the article, and maybe give it some more space. My second comment is about examples. There were many parts in the article which I read, and I was like, yes, but I wish I had an example to understand what you mean. So add them. And lastly, I was thinking regarding my first comment, I was thinking also on the relationship between the states and the federal government in the states. We see that in regulation with stronger states such as California, Massachusetts, and New York, implementing a new kind of regulation that sort of take away the power from the federal government. And I think I know it's not cities, those are states, but I think it's the same kind of relationship between the central government and the local authorities. So I think it's worth at least think about that kind of framework and maybe refer to that.
Thank you. Yaniv?
Thanks. I enjoyed the paper. I think it's really thought-provoking, and I had one very minor comment, but it might be productive for you. Thinking about consumers in global cities. So it seems like most of the paper is oriented toward cities enforcing labor regulations, etc. But when I think about the global economy and its structure, and following Meital's comment about wanting examples, so I think in my head about all kinds of examples of global cities where I don't know if all the residents of the cities, but the kind of like the more decisive electorate of the municipality would accept taxation for about anyways, I don't need to go on because I wanted it to be minor and short, but bringing in the consumers and the consumer angle to the paper about cities as places of regulation in GVCs might be helpful.
Thank you. May?
Thank you, Issi. I also really enjoyed the paper and actually learned a lot. And I don't think your optimism about cities are misplaced. And I'm glad to actually see optimism during this time. So I think it is true that a lot of cities are doing really great work. And from where I'm sitting right now, there is a renewed focus on studying cities, right, as sort of a site of resistance to state and national policy, especially in terms of things like climate change and immigration policy. So I think there is that really positive story to be told in the global value chain context, both as sites of positive regulation and also as site of resistance. And that resistance can come from either proactive regulation or sometimes it's just from the politics of cities, and as Pankhuri really adeptly described in her comments, right, the various politics between the different national and provincial and state levels. So I also really echo her comment that I'd love to see a typologies, right, of the various layers and ways of how cities can play that role, which brought me, when I read the sections about effective regulations, I'm thinking that could be either way, right? That could be effective regulations for positive or effective regulations to advance other non-progressive issues in global value chain. And that's what most of that global company town paper was about, is effective regulations of not so positive standards through special economic zones and other things. So I wonder if that might be a way to frame the typology. Is effective regulation on both way. On the other hand, sort of positive regulation can also be from both way, in both proactive legal lawmaking as well as resistance, which might not necessarily come from positive aim, but might just be from politics and self-interest.
Thank you. So I'll jump in quickly, just to say that I'm so glad you chose to eventually write on this, even though when we invited you, we thought you might go back to your roots in sustainability and environmental, because this is such a fresh perspective on this. And I think you can actually find many examples, and even just kind of harvesting the knowledge people in this room has in an email will give you a bunch of examples. And I can just think, even in I see, Catherine and Victor are here. Immokalee is an unincorporated community. Immokalee, of the famous coalition of Immokalee workers. It's interesting to see how this community in Florida, and of course these are mostly documented, mostly undocumented people who live there for a long time, and kind of there is a strong community base that is very local in a context where there is no local government. So I think it can be an interesting counterexample. There's also, I think I sent it to you at some point, maybe I didn't, and I should have, the Bartley and Fine piece about Seattle that compares the Fair Food Program and the Seattle enforcement innovation So both Seattle and San Francisco, and actually in one of Change Lab, in one of our meetings, Janice Fine is going to present her work on local government work of workers' rights enforcement, some of it in global supply chains, as a locus of kind of innovation in workers' rights enforcement. So they write in a specific paper thinking about global value chains. They write about the Seattle example. That's an interesting one. And generally, I want to say that in this kind of when I think about it in the context of labor, in this kind of multilateral type of bargaining and this kind of polycentric sources of regulation, I think you're so right to identify the local, the city, the global city as a site that so much is happening in and is often overlooked. So just generally, kudos, and I really love the article. Klaas.
Yeah, thanks. Also, essentially to echo the enthusiasm, it against his connections unstable. I hope I'm audible, and we'll keep it short. So just indeed, really a missing piece in that whole story. And I think one distinction that it kind of draws us to maybe use more vividly than we usually do is that within GVCs of industrial services and digital value chains, because it seems that cities have a very different role in their political economy, but also in the workforce that they actually attract when it comes to services value chains, and even more so when we move to gig workers. And so this definitional blurriness that Gerefi, et cetera, always have within GVCs to use this as an all-encompassing framework, actually for you, I think really makes a difference. So I wonder if there's value to get into subdividing basically what types of value chains we're really talking about in that sense.
So Issi, do you want to take a minute to respond before we sum up?
There was so much in your comments. Thank you so much to everybody. I don't think I can, in 1 minute to say much. The distinction that you make, Roy, outsourcing by the state, I didn't think about that. I think about different incentives, and not that the state is actually wants to outsource it, but it could be that if you're talking about typologies, it could be opposition to the state on the one hand, or outsourcing by the state on the other. So different things can be, thought of differently. Well, Yaniv definitely thinking about, consumer is so again, this is so rich because, when talking about global cities is different when you talk about production cities, right? Or transportation, port cities, because the constituency wants different things. So procurement in global cities, sort of kind of regulating the headquarters, would look very different from regulating labor in port cities. I don't know how can I encompass everything in 10,000 words, but maybe Pankhuri is right that there should be more papers, like 2 papers here. Thank you so much, everybody. I don't want to take more time because we are already we're behind.
Thank you very, very much, Issi and Pankhuri, and for these great comments. I think it was actually such a good way to end this conference. So I feel lucky that Jen, Catherine, and Victor asked to be first, because I feel it really opens up new avenues of thinking about this, and in some way also summarizes and brings something fresh to a lot of what we've done. So thank you very, very much what we've done in these 3 days. So I actually think I don't have much to say in summary, except I really look forward to seeing all of you in Spain and having a drink and not just seeing you in a box on Zoom. These have been kind of longish 3 days. I thought that 40-minute sessions and only 4 or 5 of them won't feel very long, but I must say I just wrote to Guy telling him, I'm totally zoomed out at this point. And so, I don't really have much to say. Dan already presented the timeline. He will send you an email. We're lucky to have the theoretical inquiries in law students here, and they will send useful summaries to all of us of the comments we received. And I do encourage all of you to just be in touch with each other further as you think about these issues and find interesting, examples for EC, models of enforcement for Guy, Shelley, and me, or anything else that was discussed here in these last 3 days. So I think that ends it for me. Guy, do you want to sum up in a few words? You're on mute. Which is the classic way to sum up.
I mean, I got it totally wrong for 3 days now. I mean, this is really very poor. First of all, I really thought this is a wonderful last day. I thought it's papers that open up a lot of questions, and I really enjoyed this. And there was variation throughout the 3 days. I'm very excited about this. I think that there are a whole lot of ideas and papers here, more than I expected at this stage of the process. And very much looking forward to doing this in Hunyati, where it would be much nicer to be in person and have a chance to discuss this. And a bureaucratic note, we're flooding emails and stuff, but registration will need to be sorted by mid-April. So just keep an eye on our emails. We try not to send too many, but those that we do, we mean it. So don't disregard them, okay? And it's wonderful to see old acquaintances and new acquaintances, and looking forward to continue this dialogue.
And I also just want to thank our silent participants who were with us for many of these days. So Urmila and Rachel, and today I saw Emmy joining, and Ina, and there were many others who were here with us. And I believe that our conversations, we will find them in their amazing work that they're doing, and they couldn't present here today, but we will definitely learn more about them in the future as well. So thank you all, and enjoy your weekend, and we'll be in touch. And thank you so much. Hi.